pt2 ngamena kitanga pt2.
The guardians of this land, the Maori, have a rich and powerful culture full of mystique and an oral history that tells of a colourful and ancient past. The official story is that New Zealand was uninhabited 800 years ago when a fleet of 7 canoes arrived from the Central Pacific. But a strange thing happened when they got to New Zealand. Their culture changed significantly. They built planked houses with decorative facades, used single canoes instead of outriggers, fashioned terraced village sites with amphitheatres, and created curvilinear art designs quite different to the geometric shapes of the Central Pacific. So what made them change? Was it merely the difference in climate? Or was it that they were influenced by people who were already living here? There are legendary stories of little blonde fairy people living in hobbit-like burrows and red-haired giants thundering across the landscape. Do these have any factual basis, or are they all just fairy stories? In this documentary, we're going to explore a much deeper history in New Zealand. A history that explains who these blonde and red-haired people were, where they came from, and why they are rarely seen today. The answers to these questions may well surprise you. Let's start with a well-known Kiwi legend about the blonde-haired fairy people of the forest.
When the Māori first arrived here, the first canoe was the Arawa canoe to land here. Captain was Tamata Kapua, who's buried here on our mountain. When they arrived here, they found a race of little people here, little fairy-like people, called the pt2.
Māori respected them and even treated them with a little superstition, because these were the unseen people in the forest, the people they heard laughing at night and chuckling away, the people they heard rowing their small walkers across the lake at night time.
And my understanding is they were light-skinned, fair-skinned, with light to reddish hair. And they lived up on the mountain, on the slopes of Mount Moiho, in the mist. And they would come down the Onuhi Creek, down to the sea, and there they would fish. And they usually only came out at night or when it was very misty.
It is believed that when Māori came to this land, there were certain things and skills they did not have, they didn't bring with them. These are things they learnt off the pt2. Now, the making of the fish nets was something which was a bit sneaky. There was a man, I think his name was Kahupua, and he was on a beach late one night, and he became aware of a number of people fishing in the dark and pulling on what turned out to be a net. He was able to join with these people pulling this net in, and it was full of fish. As it came in, it was getting close to dawn, and suddenly the people, as the first light started to shine, they turned around, saw that there was a person who was not one of them, and also the first light of the sun in the morning is a time where pt2 take off back into the forest away from the sun. So they abandoned their catch, abandoned the fishing net. And this young man looked at it and said, we can use this ourselves. The pt2 also taught Māori the cat's cradle. Also, a Māori flute, the putarino, a very, very simple device carved from wood. And it is believed that the pt2, the fairy folk of the forest, taught Māori how to make the putarino.
And they were a magical people. They would bewitch people to put a spell on them, particularly women. and they would lure the woman away with this flute music, and they would never be seen again. And even now there's some bushmen who go up and work on the slopes of the mountain, and I've heard they say when it's misty sometimes they can just hear voices, they can hear people talking.
Did they exist as a small race of people, or were they indeed a fairy race of people?
We've been told about a place where these mythical people used to live. It's on the shores of Lake Okataina, and it's called pt2. I'll try and get out of here without doing old people noises. I could have easily slept in there, and it's actually a joiner, so maybe it was a double home for the pre-Te Arawa people who would have hidden from their enemies. Archaeologists say that there are storage sheds, but my feeling is this was a village site. There are hundreds along here. There are those that are much larger, probably family size, but not for tall people. As well as the Patuparaiahe, there's another group of fair-skinned people known as the Turahu. What do we know about them?
In areas like Te Papakanga Park out towards Thames, there's a Turahu village, and on the sign out there describing Maori oral traditions of the area, they speak of very small people with golden hair. They had a beautiful freshwater stream that ran through the village. They cut a trench from a higher point of the stream right across their arable land to provide water for their agriculture. In the valley they've got two very nice amphitheatres that they've carved out of the hill where the acoustics were wonderful. These simple kinds of amphitheatres are found all over New Zealand, and based on Maori oral traditions, the people used to go to these places like the amphitheatres and speak and sing very loudly.
After visiting two archaeological sites associated with the fairy people, Te Papakanga Park and Te Pt2, we now wonder if there are any historical records about them.
There's a guy in our history, his name was Gilbert Mair. He was well respected amongst the Māori people. And it's like this guy jumps out with his weapon in front of the whole of this platoon, which they used to call the Te Arawa flying column, and starts jumping around and displaying his weapon and doing his dance. One of the guys starts loading up his musket and points at him, and old Gilbert Mair says, you know, give the man a bit of credit, you know, look what he's doing. And then as suddenly as he appeared, he disappears. It's just a couple of skips into the bush and he's gone. What is sort of interesting is that this guy was fair as white. But the other thing was fully facial tattoo, Māori tattoo. Also the legs, everything, you know. So the interesting thing is there's a very, very tall white person brandishing a Māori taiaha with a fully facial tattoo, which was only for the ones of high rank. People think everyone got tattoos in the old days. They're wrong. 5 to 10% at the most. You had to be something to deserve, especially a facial tattoo. I was just about to mention old Maggie Papakuta. She was probably, or is the most famous of all our guides. She was basically what you call a puhi ariki, which means very chiefly woman. Anyway, she wrote a book called The Old Time Māori, and it's probably the best reference for what went on in the old days anywhere. And it was funny to hear because when I read it, it's like she mentions waka blondes, you know. You get the word blondes because of a family in here that are all fair-skinned and all blonde-haired. she mentions in this book that her best friend was a little girl called Puti. She was fair, she had blonde hair, and there's even a picture of her in this book. Puti's father was of the tangata whenua or the Urikehu clans, okay, which were the people that were basically here before we got here, okay. Well known to be, you know, tall, fair-skinned, definitely not little fairies. This lady, Puti's father, was of that clan. They lived on top of the mountain up the back here, the most sacred of all our mountains in the whole area is Nongataha. The name of their village was called Te Tuahu o Te Atua, which means the praying place to the gods. And that's basically where the Patu Paiari here lived. It's still up there. You know, we used to go out there when we were kids. And it's like you can still see the mounds, you know, that sort of thing. And as for the whānau that are in here, the Tōnahis, they are still around. They're all still blonde. Were these people real or not? They were. We've got a family, you know, who descend from them.
Yep. And I have 3 nieces who were born with red hair as well, but brighter than his.
We've got people in New Zealand who were once described as the Waka Blondes. And these are people who have a different lineage than the Polynesian people. And I grew up with many of them. I knew many of them in my formative years, worked with them on work gangs. They were the people with red hair, freckled faces. They were distributed throughout New Zealand, and they were Maori, but they had come through a completely different lineage. And a lot of them actually have very traceable whakapapa that's much, much older than any of the Polynesian Maori whakapapa. And they know where they came from. I know one individual, an old kuia, a very dignified lady, who claims to come out of Persia. And the area that she's talking about, very close to India. And when we did DNA analysis on this lady, it shows a high incidence of her blood group or her DNA in the Persian area, so she's quite correct. But then the second big block, if you like, of people that share her DNA are found in Peru.
This is very interesting, as it concurs almost exactly with a Maori legend recorded over 100 years ago by ethnologist Elsden Best when he was living amongst the Tūhoe people. The legend tells us that their ancestors in times long passed away, 165 generations or around 3,500 years ago, migrated from a hot country named India. The cause of this exodus was a disastrous war with the dark-skinned folk in which great numbers were slain. This war was recorded in the Indian epic known as the Mahabharata. The legend continues on to describe their voyages which eventually took them into Polynesia. They crossed the oceans to Tawhiti Roa, a long skinny land believed to be Central America, and then on to Tawhiti Nui, a very large land, South America. And from there they ventured into the scattered isles of the Pacific. This Tūhoe story describes a very different history to the one that asserts that the Polynesians came from Taiwan, and it could even turn Pacific prehistory on its head. Perhaps it's time we track down the lady that Martin spoke of and got her story firsthand.
Gorgeous kids, eh? We've always believed, from the history that was handed down by Piki Te Piki Kōtuku, our great-great-grandfather, that we came from this ancient place outside of Egypt named ancient Persia. Today it is named Iran or Iran, whichever way you want to say it. Well, when I told my family, they were proud when I told them that they came from ancient Persia. Some of them said, "Oh, are we Arabs? I said, well, actually, we'd be described as being Egyptian more than Arabs. There they are. Hello. This is only some of them. I got 64 together. Yeah, that's grandchildren, greats and great-greats. We're quite proud of it.
Oh gosh, won't we?
Oh, we really are. This is my mum. Her name was Tangi Maria Te Araroa Karauti. My mother was the one that gave me the history, and she wanted us to know just who we were and who we are. This is my dad, Hawani James Ham. His mother was a Waratini, and the Waratini are the blue-eyed Ngāti Hotu of Whakatane. This was my husband, Iki Whenua Mātāmua, who passed away in 2007. He is of Tūhoi descent, and they too are of Ngāti Hotu. I have here a photograph of my grandmother and my grandfather, Te Araroa Karauti. And my grandmother was red-headed, and she had the green eyes, and she was a very, very fair lady. This photograph is of Janet. Of my 10 children, she was the only one that really resembled me. And she is the only one of my 10 children that had the green eyes. But apart from that, a lot of my grandchildren do too.
We couldn't believe our eyes when we first saw Monica's family. Right in front of us was a living representation of the green-eyed, golden-haired people we've been looking for. They're not just fairy folk of the forest or mythical beings. They are real. We wonder what motivated Monica to publish her story.
Well, in 2006, I was at the hearings, and this witness was saying that we were no more, that Ngāti Hotu had been wiped out, eaten out. It was quite hurtful hearing this story, and I was sitting there and I thought, oh, hell with this. I'm going to take this through the Waitangi Tribunal and prove that we still exist. And I gave my history, the history that was handed down from Te Piki Kōtuku. And the judge at the time, which was Judge Wainwright, she put it on the internet and it went worldwide, and there was a lot of hits came back from everywhere who knew of the people of Ngāti Hotu. And it was seen by the E-Local magazine, who took up the story. And from there I did my DNA with the Geographical Society DNA Registrar. And that DNA was sent to America to be analysed. And it proved that we were of Ngāti Hotu, and every bit of the history I gave at the Waitangi tribunals was correct word to word. And my DNA took me, it went to Germany, into Russia, America, among the Inca people. Now, in Peru, there's a cave there. There's painting in the caves that depict the Ngāti Hotu people being chased out and getting into their boats. But to me, from my DNA, we came straight here after leaving Peru, after being driven out.
In South America, there is plenty of evidence of native people with golden hair and green eyes. For example, the Oricano, the Paracas redheads, and the Chachapoya blonde-headed cloud people of the Andes.
But another place I know they did go to, definitely, was Mexico, because in Mexico they found an ancient old tiki. So the tiki is not a Maori emblem, it belonged to the Ngāti Hotu people. And Mexico is in my DNA. Another thing they brought with them was the thing they put up on the teko of a man doing, with his tongue hanging out and stark naked, Bess, and that's right, it was named Bess. Yeah. Little bit of a joke of man. It is an Egyptian emblem. It's not Maori at all.
Monica showed us this wood carving with Bess on it, which was found in a swamp near Kaitaia. What caught our attention was the birdman motif at each end. This is a motif believed to be unique to Easter Island. This island, according to local legend, was discovered by a red-haired Peruvian leader or matua named Hotu Matua. Hotumatua, who shares Monica's tribal name Hotu, is said to have brought 67 Orongo Orongo tablets from Peru, a record of their history as a nation. These were written in a script almost identical to one in the Middle East that was abandoned after a war that destroyed the Indus civilization 3,500 years ago. The war that forced Monica's ancestors to flee. When Dr. A. Carroll deciphered one of these tablets in 1892, it showed that it contained a record of many wars in Peru prior to Hotumatua's escape to Easter Island. The literal meaning of Hotumatua is the leader who weeps. Hardly surprising considering they'd fled the conflict in the Middle East, only to be forced again to escape Peru and then end up on an isolated speck of land in the Pacific. An island that was named pt2 or Tefenua, which literally means the finish of the land. A land upon which over 1,000 statues were carved as monuments to their once great nation. Hotumatua's descendants eventually went on to colonize many islands in the Pacific, taking with them South American plants such as the pineapple, pawpaw and sweet potato. They also took with them the remnants of their Middle Eastern culture. This may help solve many mysteries about the connections between the Middle East, the Americas and the Pacific. To many people, the South American connection to the Polynesians and Easter Islanders is obvious. Stonework similarities, reed surfboards, kontiki-like carvings, and ceremonial towers known as the tupa in Easter Island, the chulpa in Peru, and the as yet unrecognised stone cairns of New Zealand. However, the Rongo Rongo stone in Cornwall Park in Auckland was built in identical fashion to the Orongo village houses in Easter Island and the chulpa of Peru.
This is the Rongo Rongo stone, and it's come down off one of the Auckland hills. Maori used to venerate particular stones that had a much older lineage. They didn't necessarily, in every case, know what the meaning of the stone actually was, but this one is dedicated or in veneration of the potato god. And in our museums around the Auckland area especially, we have many of the potato god statues. Also on Makoia Island, there's a very, very good statue there of the South American potato god.
Legend also has it that Orongo had red hair and was from Easter Island. When he arrived with the Kumara, where did he land? I'm in a place called Orongo Bay. Now, Orongo Bay is situated in the Bay of Islands on the east side of North Island of New Zealand. And had anybody been sailing to this location from the Eastern Pacific, this would have been a truly perfect place to land. There's mangrove forests full of fish and food, and they would have been able to feed their people very easily. Orongo, after whom the bay is named, is one such sailor. And he is actually elevated to the level of a god in New Zealand history. He is the god of the Kumara. It is well documented that the Kumara came from South America, and to this day Kumara is a staple crop in New Zealand. Underneath many of these Kumara plantations are the remnants of drainage ditches that early people used to irrigate, fertilize and gain access to their crops. The Aztecs in Central America built very similar drainage ditches.
they're draining these swamps for some unknown reason in the early days, or whether they were a passage for boats, you know, to come up. But there was evidence on this peninsula down here of those, but due to the kumara cultivation and the farming and operation, nothing there. But apparently there's supposed to be still some up Ahipara, up Kaitaia.
Not far inland from Orongo Bay, set amongst the kumara fields of Northland, is a power site called Te Ahuahu. This name refers to the gods of Easter Island, Aku Aku.
This is Great Mercury Island, or Ahuahu, where traditionally the Māori grew kumara, which was then transported to the mainland and traded.
This evidence clearly connects New Zealand to Easter Island, but are there any people who can attest to that? Yes, there are. There is a founding tribe who say they come from Easter Island, and their name is the Waitaha.
They call me what they call Ngā Upukari, which is chief of all chiefs. My full name is Hori Kupuna Manuka Manu, but they call me George Conley. And I come from the Kaipara here. My tupiness went right back into Waitaha.
Where did they originally come from?
They originally came from East Island, Rapa Nui. And they only get hit here, they call themselves Waitaha. You know what Waitaha meant? Beside the water. Up here, Waitaha started up here and went down to the South Island hunting moa.
Yeah, some of them did go down the South Island. Well, Waitaha can connect back to me because originally they lived around Taupo. Oh, my grandson, I sent him to Taranaki because there were some people there from Waitaha.
Okay.
And he met them. And when he met this woman over in Taranaki, he said he was looking at me.
There is indeed a strong resemblance between these people. While we were driving around New Zealand, not only did we see signs pertaining to Easter Island, but also in both South and North Islands, the extensive evidence of Waitaha presence. Noel Hilliam added this to the Waitaha story.
Oh, that's the Waitaha carbon that originally Maxine found.
Why do we think that's the Waitaha carbon? What is it about it that's Waitaha?
Because it's got a 5-fingered hand, and the style of carving, and also the old Waitaha lady that got hold of me, where the village was, when we go down there and exactly where Maxine found the carving.
Waitaha is the name of the people who have been in this land for many, many generations. 67 generations ago, Rakai Hautu arrived here. The Waitaha people were here for many, many years before the arrival of large numbers of Maori people. They lived in small scattered communities right throughout the length of these islands and offshore islands. Well, we facetiously sometimes say that Waitaha welcomed the Maori, and we did welcome them. But eventually, in time, we were, I guess, overrun. The Maori were a very well structured, very well organised people. They had more warlike qualities than Waitaha. They had weapons. They very quickly understood from the teachings of Waitaha how to exist in this landscape that we call New Zealand. And so in time, Waitaha moved further and further back into the background. And because the last remnant populations were in scattered places, and because the colonial historians who came to these lands didn't ask, didn't inquire, the stories have remained in the shadows.
Barry Brailsford, writer and historian, has studied the oral history of the Waitaha for many years.
And when this story began, when the elders called me to tell the story of Waitaha, to bring it out for the first time, they said it's a very multicultural story. It has huge strands that intertwine. And a lot of people won't believe a bit of it. But it's the truth of our lines. But they're all in songs. They're all in chants. And they're held within places we call houses of wānanga, storehouses of knowledge. Within the wānanga there still remained over 3,000 chants that carried the old law, that described everything of their history, their past, that described their relationship with all around them. That was the core of their life. The first time I wanted to sit with them, the first time I was invited to sit to them, unfortunately was rather late at night. And they said, who do you want to hear about? And I said, the Rā Kaihotu, the great explorer, the great navigator. And they said, oh, yes. Yes, we have a wonderful, wonderful Waitaha song of Rā Kaihotu. And, yeah, yes, but it lasts for 2 days. And I looked a bit crestfallen, you know. So Waitaha travelled here from Easter Island. They sailed here on Great Waka of a crew of 170. Half of them were men, half of them were women, because that's the way Waitaha moved. They had a society that said we don't walk without that relationship of men and women. And they came to this place and found there were already people here. And that raises lots of questions about the settlement of the Pacific. And they brought a culture of peace and established that here. Waitaha believed to take the life of another was to destroy your own. That's where they began, that was their baseline. The mainstream understanding has still got a long way to go. At the moment, our history in New Zealand for the arrival of the first people goes back a mere 800 years at the very most. But in fact, you know, if we start getting the deeper story, then Waitaha say they came here something like 77 generations ago, which is, yeah, that's nearly 2,000 years. But when they came, they said there were people already here.
Well, Kupe described them as a fair nation of people. Everywhere he went, they were fair-skinned people. Even Māori are aware, even the government is aware. The writings of the likes of Kupe, when he came here, the land was already populated throughout New Zealand, wherever he went.
When Kupe came into the harbour, was a saying, "Ko ka ke ngāhi," the fires of occupation were already alight. And the people that were here before Kupe arrived were known as Te Kahui Maunga, which actually just confirms, not only for us, but for other iwi that say they were here before the Waka migrants, that we were here. And so it confirms, just in that one phrase that he's left over the generations it's been handed on, that we were here when Kupe entered into the harbour here.
And then when Toi Kairako came over from Rarotonga on the Te Paipai ki Rarotonga, he described the place as being populated too. And Toi did describe them as being very fair. Or he called them as being white actually. And they had red hair and green eyes. Toi came here looking for his grandson, Whatonga. And his first visit was at Auckland, and they told him that his grandson had passed through there years before. So he sailed on and he landed at Whakatane. And when he stopped there, there was already tribes living there. And there were two different tribes. There was a dark race and the Ngāti Hotu people. And only the Ngāti Hotu people fed them because they were starving. And on board his ship he had two sisters. These two sisters were Hinawai sisters. And these sisters married the two Ngāti Hotu chiefs living there. And today that is our tribe.
Toi married into the Ngāti Hotu as a way of becoming an accepted member of the community, and this was fairly standard practice. It was called becoming a person of the land, or tangata whenua.
It's like even the people of Aotea, when they got to Taranaki areas, high-ranked chiefs and princesses of the Aotea canoe married into the two tribes that were there. They were known as Kahui Hau and Kahui Maunga, and I think there's two streets down there still named that. This would make you official to the land. If you weren't tangata whenua, then you were like a visitor. You had to check in and check out sort of thing.
So it seems that intermarriage between the native redhead population and the newly arrived black-haired Polynesians formed the basis of New Zealand's heritage. This was reiterated by Ngāpuhi leader David Rankin, who is quoted as saying, "Who were those red-headed, fair-skinned people who greeted our walkers? We can't deny our oral history. If we try to as Maori, we're actually denying our history."
There is another tribe on the east coast, which is the Ngāti Parau from East Cape. And I remember I knew quite a few Ngāti Parau when I was in Wellington. And I know that there are some Ngāti Parau that are fairly fair-skinned, some even freckled, and they have red hair.
Yeah, many of them are Ngāti Hotu who were married from Ruaputuhanga. She was of Whanganui descent and she was of Ngāti Hotu. And a lot of the people of Maniapoto and Whanganui come from her. Yeah, and I can trace my lineage back to her anyway.
It appears there were many tribes descended from these light-haired people with green eyes, but despite their different genetic makeup, the Waitaha and the Ngāti Hotu have contributed dynamically to Maori culture and have formed the foundation of many tribes today.
Kia tū ngā mana ki tanga e te atua.
When we observe the Maori population today, there is little evidence of the gold-haired, green-eyed people. So what happened to them? To help us answer this question, let's look at what happened in the Central Pacific. The redheads of New Zealand are not alone. There are legends and documented records of early explorers meeting the red-haired people throughout the Pacific. For example, when Captain Wallis on HMS Dolphin visited Tahiti in 1767, they noticed that over 10% of the population were white-skinned with golden hair, especially on the islands of Huahine and Raiatea, a name that originally meant the white-skinned people of Ra. When Captain Cook visited Tahiti 2 years later, the golden-haired people had all but disappeared. He was told that they had become sick and died just after the departure of the HMS Dolphin. Could it be that these white-skinned, golden-haired people were more susceptible to European diseases than the Polynesians? This might indicate that their lack of resistance to European disease means they weren't of European origin despite their appearance. To this day, Samoans, through annual festivals, venerate their red-haired ancestors. Some of these were peace-loving, but others, under the reign of Batuku the Longskull, were bloodthirsty cannibals who lived on a bay called the Putrefaction of Men. These cannibals would prey upon the peaceful people of Tonga and Futuna. They particularly fancied the firstborn child. They'd noticed that the second often died, therefore the first must be much stronger. Their belief was that they would take on the strength and qualities of the people they ate. But did they misunderstand what was really happening? It is well known now that the recessive gene is often accompanied by the rhesus-negative blood group, in which second children frequently die. So the red-headed blood group would have been incompatible with the Polynesian chiefs, who were renowned for taking red-haired women for their wives. This would have severely curtailed the number of redheads in the Pacific. Patuku's reign of terror was brought to an end in the 13th century when Polynesian chief Savea rid Samoa of those barbarous fair-skinned savages. Unfortunately, the peace-loving redheads of Easter Island and New Zealand may have been caught up in the aftermath of this war. This seething hatred towards the redheads resurfaced on Easter Island in 1680, when, due to a terrible famine, war broke out and all but 3 of Hotumatua's descendants were driven into a raging fire in the Poiki ditch. Only one male, Ororina, remained to perpetuate the redheads on Easter Island, who are still fighting for their survival today.
Well, I know the Ngāti Hotu people, they were a peaceful people. They didn't know war and fighting until the Māoris arrived. But between Taupo and Ruapehu, 3,000 Ngāti Hotu were killed by 2 whareto. And there were 600 killed here in Taumaranui by the Maniapoto people. And that was the last cannibal feast of New Zealand. It was held here at the Cherry Grove, and 600 Ngāti Hotu perished. And after the Battle of Te Pōrere, over Te Koti, the Crown ordered anyone that was with Te Koti were to be beheaded. So they headed back into the rugged parts of the Taurewa, and they were the last survivors. This picture of my grandmother, Te Oti Mihitarina, was one of the 5 survivors of the Taurewa forest in the year of 1860.
This is one of the caves that had all the skeletons of the Turihu and Waitaha people stacked in. There's skulls and skeletons all around here. In 1861, Robinson's bone mill come up from Onehunga and gathered them all up, paid all the workers threepence a sack to grind up as bone dust fertiliser. And they all shipped out of Te Kopu here. The Armed Constabulary were there, and they counted these skulls in each sack, and they estimate at least 60,000 skeletons were recovered from just this one region. And fortunately, they didn't get them all. There's a couple of caves with these fellows in. The Turihu, the coffin's about 5 foot long, made out of New Zealand kauri.
Do you have any of these skeletons?
Oh no, I've.
They have to go somewhere.
No, I've just left them where they are. Well, I'll tell you what happened. Dr. Paul Moon of Auckland University fame was doing a book some years ago, This Horrible Practice, about cannibalism. I didn't know him from a bar of soap. He got hold of me and says, "Oh, Noel, can you show me some of these cannibal sites, the remains of these cannibal sites?" So rather than bring him up around this area here over the east coast, north of Wongaree, there's a number of sites that I knew of, so I took him up to one of those. And he was a great excited photograph and what have you, and then he found they weren't Maori bones, he wasn't very much interested. And the next night on New Zealand television, here he was there with his mates, gathering all boned up, stuffing them in plastic bags. They went down the road somewhere, dug a hole and threw them in there. Well, the Maori don't treat,
That's not how they treat their dead.
No. And so Dr. Paul Moon got the message from me, and I was very keen to get DNA and everything done on, who were these people, where'd they come from. And I was at a conference some years ago in Rotorua, and there was a forensic pathologist from England. I was talking to him about them, and he said, "Oh, I've got a few days after the conference, I'll come up." So he spent 3 days with me. I took him around these various sites. There's just one of the many sites. I took him to about 5 different sites. And so he started examining them, and what he was staggered was the tree panning in the skulls. And he says, "Oh, this one lived, this one died." I said, "How do you do that?" And he showed me how to put your finger in it and run your finger around. If there was a ridge, they lived, they survived. If it was just straight, they died. But you can imagine laying on the ground and boring a hole in the skull. But this is an old Egyptian, Greek practice, tree panning.
Small people?
Oh yeah, about 4 foot, 4'3". And well, you see the skeletons, he examined them all, measured them, and he took an eye tooth to England. And 18 months later, he says, "Noel, those are ancient Celtic people living in Wales 3,500 years ago. This is where they originated from."
This is not the only genetic information that links the fair-skinned Maori to the Celts. Jean Dosset did a study on the redheads of Easter Island and found that their DNA was very close to the Basque and Welsh populations of ancient Europe. 2 more recent genetic studies have confirmed his findings. Not only did they have 16% ancient European ancestry, but they also had 8% Native American DNA.
You go back to the islands, you're not going to see the swirling, the intertwining things, Where does this come from? And it's like, man, I could translate that and make it look exactly like a Celtic pattern. So we had to be influenced by peoples or surroundings that were already here.
We had at least 3 distinct groups of the Patupaiarehe. Some were very, very tall. They seemed to occupy the whole west coast and areas inland. I think their big skulls have been found over at Otrahonga in the limestone country. Whenever these skeletons are found, they're turned over to iwi and destroyed.
Martin went on to tell us about the Raglan Giants, so we're heading there now to see what we can find. When we arrived at Raglan Harbour, we noticed some flat-topped hills that, according to the local Maori, were fashioned by red-haired giants. These people also lived on the coast at the foot of their sacred mountain, Karioi. In a battle with the marauding Tainui, they were driven over the edge at Tototo Gorge, and their bones littered the base of the cliffs. We were told giant skulls could still be found hidden in the crevices and caves along the Raglan shoreline. It is said their heads were the size of pumpkins and their jaws could fit around one's own with over an inch to spare. Just north of Raglan is Port Waikato, where similar skeletons have been found.
There are two major caves in the Port Waikato area where the great big skeletons are supposed to have been found in the 1800s. And there have been a number of articles and that about them. But I think a female skeleton out there was somewhere in the vicinity of 7 foot or a little bit over, and there were some male skeletons found that were taller than that.
People who actually went into the cave reported that there were skeletons way down in the cave, which were quite tall humans, and also they had remnants of red hair on their skulls. We have researched that area ourselves, trying to find the location of the cave which they covered in, but over a long period of time, how would you ever be able to find where they'd blown the cave up? And there's no one around today that can tell us.
In our search for skeletons, we heard about a cave burial on the shores of Lake Okataina. We were told there were 2 bound skeletons guarding a canoe surrounded by poisonous tutu berries. In the canoe lay a cloaked red-haired chief wearing a large tiki. After a painstaking scramble through ancient kawa forest, past giant puriri and karaka trees, we finally found it. Only to discover that almost everything had been destroyed except for a small section of a highly decorated burial canoe. We have just had a conversation with an excavator driver. He was doing an excavation up in Northland, and he was clearing the ground, and he saw what he thought looked like some white footballs in the ground. So he cleared a little bit around these white footballs and found them to be skulls. He didn't feel good about this at all, so he called the Auckland Museum, and there he was told by a person that there was absolutely nothing they could do at the museum because the local iwi or tribes had no interest in these skeletons because they were not of their era or of their clan, and that so tied was the curator's hands that he explained to our digger driver friend that there were over 2,000 of these skeletons that had been found, hunched in a fetal position and bound, and yet buried north of Russell in a place called Awanui. And they simply had to be excavated over the top of. There was nothing they could do. Our question is, good gracious me, what are these skeletons? Who were they? And why were they being destroyed? I mean, for goodness sake, if you touch a skull today, you're up for a huge fine, possibly even a prison sentence. What is going on that it was all right to just continue excavating over the top of these skeletons? This almost seems, well, A, it's hypocritical, but B, it's almost criminal.
In 1981, the government called in the New Zealand Forest Service and the Land and Survey to survey all the stonework up in the Waipua there, because they were going to clear fell. There had been a lot of pine trees planted on the western side of the Waipua, and so there was a team of 36, and I was the 37th archaeologist. We were up there for over 12 months doing the work up there, and then the initial dating came through, 2225 BC, and the Maori guy that was in charge, next day he closed the whole operation down. There was over $500,000 of taxpayers' money spent on this archaeological thing. All the findings, mapping, all the work we'd done was deposited in the National Archives in Wellington with a hold on for 75 years. And Gary Cook successfully got some of them released a few years ago, but all the carbon datings, they've all disappeared.
Gone.
There's one of the walls that we exposed up in the Waipoa there, and the top of that wall was ground level.
It's been closed down now.
Oh, yeah.
You can't go into that forest at all?
Oh, you go and you might never come back out.
So it looks like going into the Waipoa forest is out of the question. Luckily, there are other places around the country similar to the Waipoa site that can still be seen. The Auckland Airport, Te Papakanga Park, and on a farm in Northland. Here, we were shown around by Vince, a local farmer.
When I first came here, some of these piles were round, straight sides, some were square, straight sides, some were oblong. Nearly all dead straight sides, very loosely constructed, as you can see. You can see right through into them, see the small pebble stones inside them.
Yep.
That's how loosely constructed they are. Watch they don't fall down on you, love. Because they don't take much to fall down. As you can see, the balls have broken a bit.
I've broken them easily, yeah.
And when I first saw them, some were dead flat across the top with big stones, and some were piles going up to a cone on the top.
The similarity between the chulpa of Peru and what Vince is describing is pretty obvious. But why is this information not public knowledge? Who's hiding what and why? So there's been archaeologists out here looking at these things?
In the past, about 35 years ago apparently.
And what are they
saying?
I'm not
sure what they've come up with really. We were told that
they dug down?
That they have unearthed over 70 mounds. There's estimated over 3,000 mounds here. We were told that they'd unearthed over 70 of them. They found no ash, they found no bone, there's no soil, there's been no evidence of roots or anything in them.
What they built those fences for, whether they were keeping animals or birds, well, there was no real animals, poultry or something in these confined areas, but we never actually got down because the whole site was closed down.
And you can't go in there now?
Oh, hell no. Like I was on the Northern Regional Committee here, the New Zealand Historic Places Trust, for over 25 years, and when these datings came along to our quarterly meeting up in Kerry there, the chairman got up and said, "You're not to say or do anything, Noel, about them." I said, "Thanks, got up and thanked him very much, and I resign here and now on the spot. I won't have anything more to do with the Historical Places Trust." But through the cover-up of what happened in the Waipoa, this guy did hand in his ticket. One of the honest guys that, knew the facts and that, and this bullshit that goes on. And
my particular generation and those before me here in New Zealand were raised with a particular kind of history. And it's in all of our old history books. Maori, Kaumatuas, Tohungas were very open about their history, and they shared it with the colonial anthropologists or archaeologists who came through. And you found that the old people, if they thought you were worth talking to, would take you aside and they'd tell you all the old stories. So we just knew what the history of the country was directly from the Maori kuias and elders themselves. Came back to New Zealand in 1974 and noted that there was sort of an enforced amnesia being put over the people of the country where we just weren't allowed to know that old history anymore. And it seems we were being led to forget all of that for somebody's political agenda or for political expediency. And I knew it to be false, and I watched as our older history books were taken off the shelves of the libraries and replaced by sort of a new wave of Marxist history books that negated all of that former truth.
And mind you, all these books that have been written up of Ngāti Hotu, they all go to the fiction shelf today.
A great many people say we don't exist. The law of this land says we don't exist. The Minister of Treaty Settlements says we don't exist. But we are here, our oral traditions are here, still alive and well, and resting with people who are carrying on that tradition.
Ana, he momo kōrero, kei raro I te motu whāre ki tēnā. E kōrero e ore ore tonu ana. Underneath our earthen counterpane still lurks the history that has yet to be told, not only within here, within Te Atiawa, but right throughout New Zealand. We've got a dynamic history. Allow us to share it. Allow us to share it.
We've kept our history to ourselves. We would never had told it. There's no use telling it because no one would believe you. They just think you're a crank and a nut pot.
But this is what is going on, you know. Our institutions and the brainwashing is going on. They've rewritten New Zealand's history.
From Wellington?
Yeah.
And that's Kiwi or?
Oh, it's governmental, departmental control. They don't want anything pre-Maori or pre-Tasman to come out.
It was easier to sweep us under the carpet. Because today our fight is really against the Crown, not the Waitangi Tribunal itself, or the people. You can't blame the people when they got, you know, when they've got the power behind them.
If we could have a Royal Commission inquiry and get the true, you know, academics in New Zealand and the groundwork people, do a complete, all the evidence is there.
As Noel says, it is imperative that we have a Royal Commission to make public this vital history that at present is being denied. There's no doubt that there were earlier people living here who were either red or golden-haired. Now, what would it take to give the Ngāti Hotu and the Waitaha people back their rightful position and place as the foundation of Maori culture in New Zealand, and stop this fascinating history from being lost forever?
Kia tū ngā mana ki tanga e te atua. Kia tū ngā mana ki tanga e te atua.
The Maori have an ancient and very complicated culture, with many connections to other parts of the world. In this episode, Under the Carpet, we're going to present a more complete picture of New Zealand and her very complex past. In the first episode of Skeletons in the Cupboard, we explored the story of the red-haired people of New Zealand and their arrival into the Pacific via Peru and Easter Island. We met Monica Matamua, whose DNA ancestry dated back to ancient Persia. And we heard from a number of historians, all of whom offered information about hidden evidence and lost archaeology. Before that, in Cousins Across the Sea, we delved even further back to an ancient legend which told of the early Hawaiians coming from Alaska, a legend that has been buried in the vaults of the Bishop Museum in Honolulu. The common thread in these two films is the hiding, the obfuscation of important oral histories and the disparaging of proven yet inconvenient evidence. In this episode, we're going to go deeper, under the layers of lava, volcanic ash, sand and embargoes, to discover the deepest, darkest history of New Zealand and to find out just how long people have really been living here. Let's begin by listening to Barry Brailsford's thoughts on this subject.
I think back to 40, 50 years ago when the great mission was to find where the Maori came from. And everyone was looking for one source, the one way. There's one answer for everything. No way for one way. So you get those people who use things like stone adzes and whatever to track the Maori back up into the area near China, Taiwan and whatever, and say, well, the adzes prove it, it's in the stone. But then you get other people like Tohai Dahl who said, well, actually, there are things that suggest they might have come from South America or elsewhere, North America, who knows. But let's keep the story open and see where it goes. So this whole matter of who reached New Zealand and when is now, as far as I'm concerned, a very open book.
Another author, Gary Cook, who is also interested in this early history, agrees it's a very open book.
Right, it certainly is. The Secret Land of People Before was a book which was inspired by the fact that for many, many years, from a very, very young boy, I'd heard stories of the fact that there may have been other people living in New Zealand prior to the people we know as Māori coming to this land. In our research, we started to discover that there was archival material in libraries and museums around the country in the form of early writings by anthropologists and early explorers in this land, in the forms of diaries and reports in the journals of the Polynesian Society and the transactions of the New Zealand Institute. And we went through what I call the discarded history. The historians of today don't recognise, and we came up with this book, The People Before.
So what did Gary find in the country's archives?
An amazing event took place in 1874 in Auckland, right in the centre of what is now Auckland City. And workmen were working in a street called Coburg Street, which is now High Street, on the intersection of Wellesley Street, right near, outside where the present-day art gallery is. Behind the art gallery, of course, is Albert Park. And it's well known by a lot of people that Albert Park was a volcanic vent which extruded lava many, many thousands of years ago. So the workmen were putting in this deep trench. They went down many, many feet. They chipped away through 2 different lava flows, and they had an engineer with them, and he actually did drawings as they went down through the layers, through the clays and the lava. They got below the last lava flow, and lo and behold, there was a blackened tree stump there. Alongside the tree stump was an adze. And they pulled the tree stump out to examine it further because it had been cut. And it was a manuka tree, and it was quite a wide girth. Talking to geologists, there is a variance in the time that they give, but anywhere between 30,000 and 60,000 years is what some geologists say, that those lava flows came out of that vent in Albert Park in the middle of Auckland. So what we have to ask is, who was there cutting manuka tree down that long ago?
It's a good question. Who were they? Ngāi Tahu oral tradition talks of an ancient tribe living around Lake Hawea in the South Island who had dark skin, curly hair and skinny legs, very similar in appearance to the Australian Aboriginal. Their tools were also very similar, and it was said they had come from a land to the west. Genetic studies have pointed to a global expansion of a people from Africa known as the Australoids 50 to 70,000 years ago. Remnant populations of this group survive today in the DNA of the Indian Veda, the Andaman Islanders, the Ainu of Hokkaido, Japan, the people of Tierra del Fuego, and the Australian Aboriginal. The Chatham Islanders, or the Moriori, are believed to be a relic population of the early inhabitants of New Zealand, and in this picture they do resemble the Australian Aboriginal. Ngāi Tahu also assert that these people live on in their DNA to this day. But much has happened in the last 40,000 years. New Zealand's position on a tectonic plate boundary puts it in the firing line for devastating geological events, as told to us by John Johnson from the Gum Diggers Park.
There's been numerous disasters in New Zealand. In the Aopori Peninsula here, entire forest was wiped out here twice we know of, so entire forests, not just the old tree, they were completely obliterated by some disastrous event. And then again 45,000 years ago, another disaster, tsunami generated by perhaps comet asteroid impacts in the Tasman. Also there was one 6,000 years ago in a place called Henderson Bay where the deposits of a tsunami from PAPS, the Kermadec Trench, or one of the tectonic plates out in Tasman, they found deposits of, I think it was 32 metres above current sea level, which was, it was just a deposit, so the wave perhaps was a lot higher than that. And I suppose because we're a fairly low-lying peninsula, we're susceptible to those sort of events. Who knows what's going to happen next?
New Zealand has, without doubt, suffered many natural catastrophes that have annihilated populations over the millennia. For instance, the Orua Nui explosion 26,500 years ago, that was 100 times the volume of the last Taupo eruption. That would have laid waste to the entire country and its inhabitants. Even the much smaller eruption of Mount Tarawera devastated the local population. These volcanoes expel huge amounts of ash into the atmosphere, blocking out the sun's rays and causing major climatic upheaval around the world. The largest volcanic eruption in the last 7,000 years was the Rinjani volcano on Lombok, Indonesia, which erupted in 1257 AD, disrupting life in the Pacific for centuries as mentioned here by Barry Brailsford.
Something horrendous happened in the Pacific after the year 1200. In a matter of generations, there was huge climatic change, and it's coming again. We now know that the oceans warmed up by something like 1 to 2 degrees. When the oceans warm up like that, the corals die. The coral fish that feed on the corals die. And the fish that feed on the coral fish die. And the food chain breaks down. Today, archaeologists believe that in a few generations, the Polynesians lost 80% of their food resources. But not only that, there was a huge change in terms of the weather patterns. After 1200, there was a huge increase in these El Nino events. So the whole of that tropical, subtropical area was affected hugely by swings in the weather patterns from year to year. They could have fierce winds, hurricane-type events, amazing rainfalls, and then that could be followed by years of drought. You see, if you just think about it, you have 2 islands and they're only half a day or a day's canoe journey apart. And one happens to be in the path of good rains, and the other continues in drought. And the one with the rain, they get their taro crop, they get other things, they can feed their children. But in the other island, the children die. Out of this kind of incredible stress upon society came conflict. And that conflict continued and developed and grew until, to protect their children, to ensure the survival of life, they developed the warrior culture.
The people of the Pacific reacted predictably to the devastation of the environment and their food resources, but this was by no means the end of it.
Well, as the Maori stories go, fiery things coming out of the sky. There's a very interesting story in the South Island, and it looks like this event would have occurred just over 500 years ago. And the Maori and Maori legends down there, they say that the sky was full of fire, and fire came down close to the earth and set the forests on fire. And then the fire descended into the ocean out of sight of the land. Now, it's fascinating that probably about 10 years ago, an Australian geophysicist working with an undersea exploration company noticed a very large crater on the floor of the Southern Ocean not far from Stewart Island. The survey ship was able to go across this gigantic crater, and they pulled up samples from the ocean floor, not very deep in the sediment, which were tektites. So therefore, there was an event which occurred 500 years ago, and the resulting tsunami swept right up the coast of New Zealand, and it is believed also, this answers a query that many scientists in Australia have had for many years, why was there sea debris way up the Sydney Harbour up towards the Blue Mountains and caused devastation there as well. So this was a mighty event, and it was a catastrophic event.
Not only do Maoris record this event as the fires of Tamatea and the Mahuika comet impact, it was also recorded by the Chinese, who happened to be there at the time.
Yes, it's very interesting, because in the book published a few years ago by Gavin Menzies, The Year the Chinese Discovered the World in 1421, the fleet which set out from China under the Admiral Zheng Hui divided into 4 different flotillas, and the flotilla that came into the southern oceans and dipped down towards the Antarctic and then up towards New Zealand, well documented in Chinese literature, they were engulfed by this fiery cataclysmic event. And the record shows that nearly all the ships in this flotilla were set on fire and then subsequently What was left was sunk by the massive tsunami, with the exception of one of the big ships, which was sheltered in the lee side of an island. And they survived and took the story back.
What evidence is there that the Chinese visited New Zealand?
On the northern side of the Hokianga, there is, up in the ridge wall, they call it an ancient Chinese fort. There's a passage, it's carved out of limestone, rooms off and what have you, about 150 metres long. But unfortunately it's all covered with sand now and pine tree. But down in the valley below that, 1902, old Percy Harris was a kid. Him and another fellow rode over that side and came across all these plates and china and bronze cannon and what have you.
Vince Heatley saw this with his own eyes when he was a child.
This would have been 1959, 1960, thereabouts. Older brother and I, we were down at the sandhills at Okanoni, and we're looking out towards the sea. Down in the sand hollows was this, which I've put a bit of sketch on. We could see about 25 to 30 yards of it sticking out of the sand, and somebody has spent a lot of time digging this out. I couldn't climb from the bottom up onto the top. It was about a good 4 feet high, and I remember running into each of these little rooms and climbing up the sand and getting up on top and calling out to my brother, "Alan, here I am," and I'd run down and I'd run into a different one again. All the way around the rooms, there were these holes dug into this white lime rock, and when you dug down into the hole, there's a burnt log, a burnt column.
And a stump.
They were all the way around it, as though it had had
A roof
framework and something coming up over it.
Unfortunately, there has been no archaeological dig on this site, so we're unable to say how old it is or who built it.
Over the years I've asked a lot of people if they've ever seen them, and they all look at me and laugh. And this old elderly gentleman, if I remember rightly, I think is an unusual name. His name was Friday Selwyn, and he was well in the 70s, late 70s, and as a kid he could remember seeing them.
No.
And he's the only person that I've spoken to. He drew a sketch with a stick on the sand at Kotu Point, just about the same as what I'd seen. He said, "I can remember seeing that when I was a kid, and I've never seen it since, and I have been back to the sandhills many times and never seen them." I'll tell you something else that we found down there one day. On the sandhills, a different time we'd gone down from this, closer to the water and around towards the North Head more. We were walking along just after a storm, up on the sandhill still, and we found 5 wooden crates. Big wooden crates. I couldn't climb on top of them, they were too tall for me. The wind had blown all the sand away from them. Now these boxes had no nails in them. All held together with wooden dowels had been driven in through it. So we managed to get the knife in and lever, and we broke some of these little bits of doweling off, and we got the first bit of wood off. And inside it was the weirdest looking straw I've ever seen. It was straw bigger than my finger, real coarse looking straw. And next minute Alan picks up a plate and he says, "Look at this thing." And there's a white plate like this, and he says, "Look at these funny looking pictures." And he had these funny pictures all the way around the outside, and they were blue. Everything was painted blue around the outside, and it was blue, funny shaped blue buildings with things sticking up on the corners of the roofs. And I hold it up to the light, and next thing, you can see through this, look, there's the sun. We thought, bloody hell. Yeah. So we're looking at this thing there, and what are you going to do with these? And next thing, good frisbee, so I shouldn't tell you, should I? But I tell you, we made some unbelievable frisbees. You chuck one and we get another one out and we'll chuck it to see if we could break them. Well, we broke quite a few of them. But we had no idea the value of the things. God. We didn't know what they were. They were just somebody left great big boxes full of dinner plates there.
Vince's description of translucent eggshell porcelain plates gives us a fairly good indication of its age, as this type of china was produced during the Ming dynasty from 1402 to 1424. So this fits in principle, with the Chinese voyages of 1421. But was this their only visit?
On the coast here we've got 110 officially recorded wrecks. And I found another 57, and it's these unknown ones that, you know, I'm very, very interested in. And there was this washout in October, November, and one of my team was up the beach and saw these ribs sticking out. Last year came uncovered all these ribs over 400 feet long, 180 foot beam, and timber off. We've had the timber dated and we believe it could be a ancient Chinese junk. Yeah, buried in under the sand approximately where we are here. This is the top end of the ribs that were showing, and they went out on an angle out here to below low water mark, and we measured out 412 feet. And there was another one or two further out. And then over here, approximately 180 feet across, there was some of the the starboard ribs sticking out. Only out for 2 days. I got notified about it. We came up here the next morning, cut the sample timbers off. This is what I like to do with all shipwrecks, and get a country of origin and then get it dated. And 2 days later, the beach was like this again. We've been waiting for it to scour out again, but no such luck. This is a section of the top of one of the ribs, and we believe it's Chinese Yunmu. It's been dated in 3 different independent laboratories around the world, but they couldn't believe the bloody age of it. So they sent to two other independent laboratories around the world, and the timber comes out with a dating of 5,995 years old. But we're looking at the Dao dynasty, the Hermuda people.
The Hermuda culture was a seafaring nation who lived by the Yellow Sea between 7,500 and 5,000 years ago. Their DNA is believed to be ancestral to the Polynesians. A paper published by Professor Haikai Tane asserts that the Hermuda people were making regular trips across the Pacific. It had always been assumed that they sailed bamboo rafts with multiple centerboards, but the 400-foot-long shipwreck discovered by Noel Hilliam challenges our perception of the shipbuilding capabilities of these people. Please explain what that is.
That is handmade, sun-dried fabric, complete with the Coolies logo on the end. They got a grain of rice for every one of these made.
And where's that one from?
Up near the timbers of this wreck on the coast here.
Oh, true.
But perhaps someone might be able to recognise the symbol, the family.
Coincidentally, Hawaii Loa, the legendary discoverer of Hawaii, was from the Yellow Sea. According to ancient Hawaiian legend, his vessel was so big it was often called an island, and his voyages would last for over a year. Hawaiian oral history says that his brothers Kanaloa and Ki colonized the Marquesas and Tahiti respectively, and a grandson settled Samoa. Were Hawaii Loa and his brothers sailing these massive 400-foot ships 5,000 years ago? Further evidence that people were navigating the Pacific at the height of the Hermuda culture was uncovered by archaeologist Masashi Chikamori on Rarotonga, where he found a cooking pit over 5,000 years old. If a boatload of people from East Asia did arrive in New Zealand that long ago, what other evidence is there to support it?
Professor Haikai Tane published a paper in China on the discovery of icons which were carved in a rock shelter in the South Island, which are ancient Taoist Chinese, which go back in New Zealand 4,500 years. The main feature of it was a New Zealand famous rock carving called the Rua Taniwha. And the Taniwha, of course, is a mythological figure in Maori stories, often depicted in a dragon-like form and quite a fearsome creature. So this was named the Rua Taniwha. No great mystery, because anthropologists today say that the people who came out of southern China 7,000 years ago are the Proto-Polynesians, and the people that moved from southern China, southern Asia, up through the Pacific. Now, what Heike Tane found when he looked at the type of carving, he could see there were features which were familiar to him as a Taoist student. So he took copies of this drawing or the carving back to China to his teachers, who then sent it to other universities, to Taoist scholars, who then looked at the carving and said, we can read the symbology in this Rua Taniwha carving, and the carving itself, whilst it is a stylized figure, is actually a land map of the whole of the Waitaki Valley area, right from the coast, right up to Mount Cook, Mount Aorangi in the middle of the Alps. So here is an ancient map depicted on the roof of a rock overhang in the middle of the South Island.
But the Chinese were not the only people to sail to New Zealand. Some extraordinary discoveries in Northland over the last century shine a light on previous visitors, but they have yet to be thoroughly investigated. They include a Tamil ship's bell that was used by the Ngāpuhi people as a cooking pot, and a boulder found on a farm that was covered in Sanskrit writing, suggesting a Hindu presence at some time in the past.
Chalked it in, and the farmer that's saw up the Hokianga actually. He will not allow anyone near. He's the same as down here.
Are these relics from shipwrecked sailors, or did these people actually contribute to Maori culture? Jason Phillips hints that the Hindu god Shiva lives on in folklore as Kiwa.
We're the offspring of those who combed the long wavy hair of Kiwa. And Kiwa's the Pacific, the ocean, god of the ocean. It was said that our sea voyaging canoes were that fast as that they skimmed the top of the waves like a brush going through your hair.
Jason associates the hair of Kiwa to the waters of the Pacific Ocean, which is an interesting parallel to the hair of Shiva, from which flows the sacred waters of the Ganges. Having heard about Indian connections and Chinese visits, we're now wondering what else there is to this complex story of prehistorical New Zealand. Martin Dutré, in his book Ancient Celtic New Zealand, puts forward evidence there may have been an even earlier contribution to New Zealand culture by people from the opposite side of the world, who he believes were mapping New Zealand 3,000 to 4,000 years ago.
Okay, we're now at Silverdale, and in 1971 there was a great big hill here that the road used to have to wind around it. So it was decided that they would get rid of the hill and create this beautiful big intersection. But as they brought the machines in at the very crown of the hill, they found a cluster of 12 massive concretion boulders right on the top of the hill. Well, it was a real enigma, because concretion boulders can only naturally form down in sea sediments. But these were at the top of a washed clay hill. So it was a real mystery at the time as to why they were there. Well, the reason that they were there is that they were part of a massive alignment system that runs right across the Auckland Isthmus. And we've traced that alignment system from Pukemore Hill in Huntly through to the Mount William Walkway. It then goes to Totara Park in Manukau. It then goes to a mound on the top of Mount Wellington. It then goes across North Head. It then moves on to Okura Ridge over this way, where they built a mound, a great big trig mound on the top of the ridge. And it then comes to here, where there were the 12 concretion boulders on top of the Silverdale Hill, where they could work out the distances to any of the land features from working from this mapping alignment. And I talked to a kaumatua from Ngāti Kuri, and he talked about how when his people arrived in New Zealand in the year 700 AD, how they encountered another people here that they called the surveyors, because these people were so busy setting up standing stones and different types of markers across the landscape, all to do with surveying and mapping the country.
Let's hear a little more about these surveyors and what they did.
The ancient Patupai surveyors and astronomers, when they set up this particular solar observatory, they made it in exactly this position. They put it in exactly this position so that the sun would rise in line with the trench on Mount Wellington. And when the ancient Patupai astronomers saw that, they would know absolutely that that fixed point gave them their day of the equinox. And then, according to that, they could do their calendar count and figure out any day throughout the entire 365.25 day year, and all of the times of planting, harvesting, fish migrations, whatever. Now the spread between the summer solstice back to the equinox here around the Auckland Isthmus is about 30 degrees. And then of course from the equinox back to the winter solstice is another 30 degrees. So on the horizon we have a spread of about 60 degrees of sun movement through the year.
Unfortunately, academia has had very little interest in dating these hilltop sites featuring standing stones, so we don't know exactly how old they are or who put them there. Was it the Celts from some post-Atlantean civilization? Or could it have been the descendants of the famous navigator and discoverer of New Zealand, Maui? As most school children know from the myths and legends, Maui ensnared the sun. This legend is a direct reference to Maui's knowledge of navigation and celestial observations. So what else do we know about Maui?
Maui was basically the person who navigated the Pacific, probably navigated the world. Okay, if you go back to all the Pacific Islands history, what's the history of your islands? Maui fished it up. You come to New Zealand, the North Island, the great fish of Maui. You know, the South Island is canoe.
The North Island is said to resemble a stingray, with the mouth of the ray at Palliser Bay. During Maui's circumnavigation of the South Island, and upon reaching Kaikoura, he spotted the mountains of the North Island and sailed across the straits to Palliser Bay, where he was greeted by the red-haired chieftainess of Orokoroko. If Maui first arrived in the South Island, where did he land? According to Waitaha and Ngāi Tahu oral history, Maui came from the Southern Ocean and landed at Bruce Bay. Well, I'm standing here now at Bruce Bay, and about 100 kilometres due east of me rises the highest mountain in South Island, known as Aoraki or Mount Cook. This mountain, on a clear day, could be seen over 200 kilometres out to sea. And any sailor or navigator using the westerly wind belt known as the Roaring Forties and looking for land would have headed straight for it. And this is exactly what the legend of Maui says. Initially, they thought Aoraki was just a mirage amongst the clouds, but before they knew it, they'd made landfall at Bruce Bay. And they came not from the Central Pacific as previously thought, but from the Southern Ocean. So who was Maui and where did he come from?
The other story that I know about Maui is that he also came from Egypt.
Some insight to these questions came from epigraphic researcher Barry Fell when he deciphered some ancient petroglyphs on Pitcairn Island which told of damage done to one of Maui's ships in a storm. He also deciphered petroglyphs found in a cave called Casa Pintada in the San Fernando Valley in Chile. These were written in Libyan script declaring that Maui claimed 4,000 miles of the Central and South American coastline for Egypt in 231 BC. Fell was perplexed that a Polynesian ancestral figure was claiming land for Egypt, so he conducted further research and found that Maui was a navigator who'd been commissioned to circumnavigate the world by Eratosthenes, head of the Alexandria Library in Egypt under the reign of Ptolemy III. Maui had been given 6 ships and a crew captained by Rata. It can be deduced from petroglyphs and Polynesian legend that Maui's voyage followed a route that looked something like this. After circumnavigating New Zealand for 3 months, it is believed Maui travelled north to Tahiti, on to Hawaii and across to the Americas. He then sailed south for 4,000 miles along the coastline looking for a passage east. Realizing that their mission to circumnavigate the world had been foiled by the impassable landmass of the Americas, they decided not to return to Egypt to face the music, but instead went back to the islands where they knew they would be welcome. At this point, they entered the realms of Polynesian legend. It seems he made quite a name for himself in Tonga, where there's a massive stone archway named after him. It is called Ha'amonga a Maui, the burden of Maui. The Tongans remember him as a navigator of high esteem and still retain a copy of his star chart to this day. Further proof of Maui's expedition came from a cave in Irian called the Cave of the Navigators, where Barry Fell deciphered images that told of Maui's visit. This clearly shows that Maui passed through the islands of eastern Indonesia, reprovisioning his ships in the home of the Indonesian rice paddy rat, also known as Rattus exulans or Kiore, the Polynesian rat. After leaving the Cave of the Navigators, Maui experienced strong headwinds, so he chose to head south into the westerly wind belt of the Southern Ocean, arriving at Bruce Bay with rats on board. The possibility that it was Maui who brought the Kiore to New Zealand from eastern Indonesia is strengthened by the fact that some of the earliest Kiore bones come from places that Maui visited: Shag River, Palliser Bay and Hawke's Bay.
And there's an interesting thing that's come to light in more recent years, and that's work done by one of the scientists down at Otago University, and it is Matisha Smith. And she is an amazing researcher, very talented woman who's unravelling so much of it for us in the new science. And this is what she shared a few years ago. When we follow the rat lines, we find there are very ancient rat lines in New Zealand, much older than to the north in the Pacific, much older than those in the Cook Islands or Tonga or Samoa. It looks like those rats went north from here, that New Zealand was settled before many of those islands, and that turns things on its head.
Lisa Matisu Smith was not the only person who was surprised by the early arrival of rats in New Zealand. This is what Richard Holdaway had to say.
I'm an extinction biologist, and one of the main
thrust of my research is to find out when the first predators arrived in New Zealand, and one of those was the Pacific rat. The first series of dates showed that the rats had been in the South Island for at least 2,000 years. This is completely contrary to the accepted dogma, which is that they arrived at the time of settlement, which is now agreed at 700 to 800 years ago. And it's completely agreed that they came with people. Any other hypothesis just doesn't work. So whoever brought the rats must have arrived in New Zealand and must have visited both the North and South Islands 2,000 years ago.
That date was so early, scientists questioned the carbon dates. Some other form of proof was required. This cave in Hawke's Bay was buried in volcanic ash from the massive Taupo eruption 1,800 years ago. The volcanic tephra flowed over the hillside and into the cave, covering everything inside in a thick layer of ash, a layer scientists can date with confidence.
Now that line there was the floor of this cave about 1,800 years ago, when this material came in across the terrain and into the hole and filled it up from there up to here, sort of ponded it in and sealed everything underneath. And therefore we know that the material under here is older than that. There was a bone which had been collected from beneath the ash, and I dated that bone, and the date was consistent with it having the rat having died before the ash fell. All we are saying is that the rats arrived around about 2,000 years ago in the North and South Island. Rats were here about 2,000 years ago.
So we now have scientific confirmation through genetic and geological dating that shows that the rats arrived with people over 2,000 years ago. But a government employee by the name of Bruce McFadgen was commissioned to debunk Holdaway's work. He questioned the dating methodology, suggesting the rats had been eating 1,000-year-old carbon, and concocted fanciful scenarios that placed rat bones under the tephra layer by virtue of some burrowing creature, a hole-boring petrel, without any evidence of the ash being disturbed. At least McFadgen admits that none of his scenarios prove anything. Whilst on the subject of things hidden under the carpet of ash, we were astonished by discoveries made at Lake Pukawa in the 1960s. See this bone? It's a tibia, and it's the tibia of Dinornis giganteus, otherwise known as the moa. Now this bone was found during an archaeological excavation very close to where I am at the moment, near Lake Pukawa. And this bone was in an upright position like this in the lake, along with many, many others, as if the moa himself had got stuck in the mud. Now the subsequent excavations by an archaeologist named Russell Price found hundreds of moa bones that had been heated and broken. Suggestion was that somebody had been eating their dinner of moa. Price deduced that the moa hunters had set a mud trap for the birds, and once they were immobilized in the mud, the hunters would hit them over the head, cut the bodies off the legs, still stuck in the mud, and then drag them 50 meters up the slope to the campfire, where thousands of broken bones and fat-soaked soil was found. The location of this find was underneath what is known as the tephra layer from the 186 AD Taupo volcanic eruption. The little bones from these guys were found underneath that ash. What does that signify? It signifies that there were people living there prior to that explosion, and They were the moa hunters, and they were eating moa for dinner. Russell Price's work was all undertaken underneath the tephra layer, and he of course sent the bones off for carbon dating. Astonishing to him, the bones between the tephra layer of the 186 Taupo explosion and the next layer down of the Waimahea explosion came back at between 2,000 and 3,000 years old. And the bones that were found underneath the Waimahea layer came back from carbon dating at closer to 7,000 years old. Why is this 7,000-year-old moa hunter history not common knowledge? Behind me here is the Te Papa Museum of Wellington. Behind those doors is a vault. In that vault lie over 10,000 burnt and broken moa bones. Are they on display at all anywhere? No. Why? Well, there appears to be an embargo on any finds, archaeological or otherwise, that suggest that there might have been people here before the official arrival date of the Maori people. It is disturbing that much of the information regarding Price's work has now been lost or hidden. And we smell a rat when we find that once again Bruce McFadden had been brought in to debunk evidence of early human occupation. He concocted a fanciful scenario suggesting that a large femur and other cooked moa bones had fallen down cracks in the mud, thereby magically arriving beneath the ash layers. However, the dating of the bones still showed they were between 3,000 and 7,000 years old. Russell Price was crushed by this ridicule of his hard and honest work, having devoted nearly 20 years of his life to it. What is particularly intriguing is that very recently Bruce McFadden has been involved in a similar find in the Taihape area, one which appears to have uncovered the presence of moa tibias, just like our pukawa bones, in sediments below the Taupo tephra and stuck in a mud trap. To date, no torso bones have been found, which suggests that the cooking pit and midden are yet to be discovered. Now that the facts stare McFadden in the face, will he finally admit that he was wrong and exonerate Russell Price for his groundbreaking work in the understanding of New Zealand's ancient people? The length of time that people have been living in New Zealand has been grossly misinterpreted by mainstream academia. The picture is far more complex. Now we're going to have a look at the bigger picture, the timeline of the movement of people around the world leading up to the colonisation of the Pacific and New Zealand. During the last interglacial period, over 120,000 years ago, the Pygmies spread out from Africa. Then the volcano Toba erupted 74,000 years ago, decimating global populations and causing man to regroup. A taller people, who were similar to the Australian Aboriginal, emerged about 70,000 years ago and expanded across the globe. Then the Ice Age hit 25,000 years ago, and from this period came stories of blonde-haired bearded giants, followed by the redheads. Then the age of the black-haired people began about 6,000 years ago. Within this time frame, we have the colonization of the Pacific, and in our 3 movies, we've covered some of the pathways people took to get there. The trans-Pacific voyages of the Hermudu people from the Yellow Sea between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago may well be the beginning of the story of the Polynesians. The 4,500 Rua Taniwha carving and the 5,500-year-old ship Noel Hilliam found suggests they also came to New Zealand. We saw evidence to suggest that Maui came from Egypt, bringing Kiore, the Polynesian rat, 2,200 years ago. And, as we saw in the previous episode, the red-haired Hotu people came from Peru, bringing with them the kumara, or sweet potato. The broad reach of the Polynesian voyagers is confirmed by the arrival of many plants into the Pacific Islands. The Californian bottle gourd in Hawaii around 400 AD, the Mayan vanilla orchid in Tahiti about 600 AD, as well as the pineapple, pawpaw, tapioca and guava plants, which are yet to be studied. Further confirmation of their extensive voyaging is evidenced by the distinctive Polynesian skulls found on Mocha Island. Mapuche tools from the same area do look very Polynesian.
The other thing that excites me is that in Chile they recovered the chicken bones from the excavation that was done there. Those bones were from a chicken that is quite unique, and the DNA goes back to Samoa and Tonga, and they laid blue eggs. And when that news came out about what that meant, the New York Times, and I've got the little article that said, "We now know who the greatest mariners in the world were, the greatest voyagers, the Polynesians."
So as you can see, the history of the Polynesians is complex. But one thing we would like to emphasize is that there is no line that can be drawn between any of these people, as it appears from oral histories that whenever and wherever there was contact, there was intermarriage. So the Maori have links back to the first people who made Aotearoa their home.
After Kupe came, there were many iwi that arrived, Ngāti Mamo and Ngāti Ira, Rangitane. They all have a place within the history of Wellington. And then they moved on, and then came the various other iwi like Ngāti Mutunga, Ngāti Tamatea, Chawa, and we just happened to be here at the signing of the treaty. And we've maintained ahi ka.
A lot of these early tribes, the ones that have actually survived, have formed what is now Maori culture. Maori culture is not just one set of people who arrived at one time. It is a conglomeration, it is a melting pot of probably hundreds of different tribes that have contributed their energy, their culture, their stories, their ways, their tools, all sorts of different things to what is now Maori culture. But although scientists have been trying to unravel this amazing history, they are being thwarted at every turn. Groundbreaking discoveries are made, but they continue to be swept under the carpet before anyone can connect the dots to other studies that have also been hidden from the public eye. Why have there not been more archaeological studies undertaken at the location of the Manuka tree stump? Why hasn't anybody investigated the ancient ship Noel Hilliam found? And why haven't there been more studies done on the moa middens discovered under the Taupo ash? Why have Matisu Smith's and Holdaway's findings on the rat DNA been pushed aside? And why has Bruce McFadgen attacked and denigrated both Price's and Holdaway's work? These groundbreaking findings could open up new fields of research that would surely explain this complex and exciting Pacific prehistory. But why isn't this being done? Because it would mean that the history of New Zealand would have to be rewritten. For people to have a sense of identity, knowledge of their history is vital. When that history has been erased or altered, pride and understanding is compromised. And that's what's happening in New Zealand today. Nobody dares rewrite the history to tell the truth, only to rewrite it to bury the truth. And for what reason? Well, we'll leave that for you to decide.
Kia tū ngā mena ki tanga e te atua. Ki runga kia koe kia noho tōna rangi mari e ki roto i a koe e mātona tahua he whakamārama tōna
Pacific seafarers have been travelling the oceans for thousands of years. These voyagers felt at home on the water, knowing it would feed them wherever they went. They understood the winds and the currents, and they trusted the birds to lead them to new lands. In this film, we set out to explore an interesting Hawaiian legend that has fallen by the wayside, but holds the key to the colonization of Hawaii and eastern Polynesia. I'm standing here looking out over the Waipio Valley on the big island of Hawaii. This sacred place is the ancestral home of the Hawaiian royal family, and here begins a tale of mystery and intrigue. Scientists assert that these Hawaiian islands have been populated and inhabited for around about 1,000 years. Yet, the oral history of the royal Hawaiian family tells a different tale. Their story tells of arrival on these shores a long time earlier than that, around about 2,000 years ago. Why has their story been ignored? Now, the word Hawaii or Hawaiki actually means homeland to all Polynesians. Could that be a hint as to whether this is actually the crucible of all Hawaiian and Polynesian society? And as the Waipio Valley was, according to the Hawaiians, the political and cultural centre for society, we decided that it was logical to begin our perplexing story right here. As we bounce our way down into this sacred valley of the kings, we wonder if our guide Hulalani, a direct descendant of the chiefs who resided in this valley, will be able to show us evidence of the age and depth of history of this sacred place.
My name is Hulalani Koino I Kamakanianu Heopuna, and we are our family property. That was from Chief Opunui to the Hussies to the Kikoalanis. And this is our burial area. This is what we used to pound the poi in. My grandma used to have the poi pounder that we found here next to that. This is the lahala tree, and with this around a coconut tree and tea leaf is how you identify a burial site or heiau site. On the side of the pali, you get one big hole with a koa canoe inside with bones, that it's still located up there.
As Hulalani is showing us around her family property, she describes a history that goes back only 300 years. And we realize that much has been lost through the passage of time. Tsunamis have also taken their toll on this valley, and little or no physical evidence of the deeper history that lies beneath the ground is visible. However, what we did see was some graves of the chiefly families of Hawaiian royalty, but not the one we'd hoped to find. The grave of Solomon Peleolani, the chief who was responsible for documenting the legend that we are investigating, which forms part of the Hukumu Kalani, Hukumu Kahonua. His burial place remains hidden to this day. Our legend begins with a rather unexpected statement that the ancestors of the Hawaiian race came not from the islands of the South Pacific, for the immigrants from that direction were late arrivals there, but from a northern direction, that is, from the land of Kalonikakeke, now known as Alaska. Yes, this is a very controversial statement, and maybe that's why it has been hidden for so long. Buried in the vaults of the Bishop Museum in Honolulu. The legend goes on to describe the provenance of the ancient people of Hawaii and relates the story of a devastating flood that swept over the Hawaiian Islands, forcing their escape to Alaska. And finally, the triumphant return to the islands from Alaska by Chief Nu'u and his family. We will revisit the details of this legend throughout the film. But first, let's have a little geography lesson. Alaska lies about 4,000 kilometers northeast of the Hawaiian Islands and is very nearly the closest mainland to Hawaii. These islands sit at the northern apex of the Polynesian Triangle, with New Zealand in the south, Easter Island in the east, and Tahiti in the middle. Hawaii is the name of the largest and youngest of the 8 islands that comprise this archipelago. Each island has its own unique history, but first we're off to Kauai, the oldest of the islands. And our visit began with a relaxing paddle on the Wailua River and a visit to the Hawaiian village of Kamokila. It was there we met Puna, who told us about a lady over near the Waimea Canyon who we should definitely talk to.
Do you have any stories that may have been passed on through the ages?
Well, I can relate to you only the stories that have been handed down from generations to generations. You know, that's how stories, that's how history and culture is preserved, is through the oral history. At birth, when they were born, they were really looked over, check their fingers, see any deformities, yeah? And the midwife would know immediately by the shape of the head or whatever it is, what that destiny is for that child.
Oh, how amazing.
And many times, a name will be given to that child so that it will perpetuate that, whatever that child's destiny is. Hawaiians didn't have melody. It was mainly glottal chanting.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Melody was brought in after 1820 by the missionaries. You know, we think all of these old chants are all, you know, but that's where the history is. It's all in this chant. Culture's in the chant, yeah. Interesting.
In New Zealand, we also heard how Polynesians place great importance on remembering their oral histories.
We were taught by our old people, and it was because we never had a written language that a lot of our stories and our histories were passed on mainly through word of mouth, or they were told through a lot of our art forms. All of our carvings and our patterns have different meanings, so that was sort of like our writing in days of old. When we walk into our houses of whakairo or our carved houses, we're walking into a visual library. So all of these carvings have different stories that they portray about our ancestors, about the lands that we used to live on.
The Māori people being the only, maybe some of the islanders as well actually, that can trace their genealogy and actually recite their genealogy back to the Creator. Okay, and that's where a lot of the history of our travels and our buzz comes from, is from the whakapapa. And that was one whole school of learning. Was whakapapa was that important that you were taught it over and over again so that you'd never forget it. Therefore you'd never forget where you came from and that sort of thing.
Deciding to head to the legendary homeland of Kalonikakeke, or the Pacific Northwest, we choose Haida Gwaii, the homeland of the Haida Nation, as we are fascinated by the similarity and meaning of the names Hawaii and Gwaii, both which mean homeland, and we wanted to see if they placed a similar importance on remembering oral history.
When a child was born, they would watch them very closely, and all the men in the longhouse with white hair, meaning the elders, would choose a youngster, and as soon as he started talking, I suppose they started a certain amount of training, and then it would progress until they would relate a section of the creation stories one night, and the next night it was up to the trainee to relate word for word perfectly what he had heard the night before. And the minute he made one mistake, everything was shut down and everyone had to go to bed and start again the next day.
A quick recap then. We heard from Alitha in Kauai, Nettie and Jason in New Zealand, and then from Diane in Haida Gwaii, all stressing that oral histories are taken very seriously indeed. Why do the scientific papers ignore them? Returning to the legend, one part that fascinates us is the story relating to Chief Nu'u and his family's arrival in Hawaii from Kalonikakeke. Although Alitha had not heard of Chief Nu'u, she suggested that the people of Molokai may know of him as they held on to some of the older legends.
The only place that my great-grandmother went was to Molokai, and that was to replenish her mana. She would go there periodically. Molokai was known as one of the most powerful spiritual places.
Now, we've heard of a lady called Auntie Snooky, who is the keeper of genealogies in Molokai. So that's where we're off to next. As we approach the island, mysterious structures in the ocean hint at a deeper history.
According to my documentation here, his name is Nu'u o Kahina Li'i.
Auntie Snooky's genealogy has provided us with an independent source of confirmation of Nu'u's existence, his wife Lilinoe, and their 3 sons. This genealogy, which places Chief Nu'u's arrival in Hawaii approximately 2,200 years ago, is very exciting, because it agrees with the findings of geneticist Bing Su and Mark Stoneking that, and I quote, Eastern Polynesian DNA showed a rapid population growth from a small isolated group 2,200 years ago. Could this small isolated group actually be Nu and his family? And could this legend really hold the key to the colonization of Hawaii? Let's listen to it one more time. Nu'u travelled from Alaska with his wife Lilinoe, their 3 sons and their 3 wives, in a canoe called the Royal Canoe of the Continent. And it came to rest upon Mauna Kea, the White Mountain on the island of Hawaii. We're on the top of Mauna Kea. This would have been the mountain that Chief Nu would have seen from his boat way out there on the Pacific. Maybe 200 miles out, he would have seen this mountain with snow on top, and he named it White Mountain, and he headed straight for it, and then he would have found the cliffs of Hawaii. Closing in on the island, he would have seen a treacherous, lethal coastline of rugged cliffs and nowhere to land until he reached the safety of the Waipia Valley. This is the beach, the very beach that 2,200 years ago Chief Nu would have arrived, and they would have seen these incredibly steep sides, this valley with this wonderful river flowing out into the ocean. And they would have seen a safe haven. They would have recognized it as something very similar to their own origins, where they've come from Canada, from Alaska, from Kalonikekeke. And they would have known that this was a place they could make their home.
Those valleys are eroding and covering, every time it floods, it covers it with silt, little layers year by year. So slowly stuff gets down deeper and deeper in a alluvial valley like that. All you got to do is dig down and you will find some old stuff in there for sure.
And they haven't done that. Why haven't they done that?
The people in this valley, who I believe came from Canada and Alaska, where they have ice and sleds, used to have a sport where they'd slide down the grassy slopes on a sled.
Kalonikekeke, or Alaska, seems to be the key here. And the only person who has investigated this concept to any depth was Tor Heyerdahl. Tor Heyerdahl, famed for his Kontiki expedition, proved that Pacific travel by sailing rafts was possible. And he was also a proponent of a northwest coastal provenance of the Polynesian people. Let's have a look and see what it was that grabbed his attention. We're going to have a chat with the curator of archaeology here, Dr. Grant Keddy. And we will be really interested to see what his ideas are about our hypothesis of the origins of the Polynesian people.
Tor Heyerdahl, like most scientists, as the new information comes in, they change their mind. He was a very open-minded person who looked at many different things, had a broad interest, but he was always looking for more and more data. later in his life, when Tor Heyerdahl visited me at the museum here, we talked about a lot of this stuff, and he was, unfortunately, he died before he got into some of these things. And if you ask the question, do we have any evidence of connection between native people on the northwest coast and Polynesia? Well, we don't have any evidence that's clear right now, but did it happen? Well, it's certainly possible it happened. Some Polynesians made it to shore here, native people made it to there. It's certainly possible, knowing what we know about ocean currents and canoe travel and that sort of thing. You know, now that we know a lot more about the history of the northwest coast and a lot more about the history of Polynesia, what should we be looking for? If you're to look to parallels with Polynesia, I could show you these bird figures that look like the bird figures on Easter Island, right? Then you've got things like these, bone clubs and stuff, and you could probably find certain bone clubs that are similar in Polynesia. So they're one could look at the symbolism and everything in there and say, well, is there any kind of patterns or designs? You look at that when you say, whoa, that kind of remnants of those Hawaiian hats, right? There's two types of canoe bailers on the west coast, the same two type in Polynesia. Hand mulls appear on the coast here, say around 2,200 years ago. So that's definitely before they occur in Polynesia, right? You have the what we call the stirrup-shaped mulls that come in several different varieties. So those are strictly on the northern coast. The ones that have the T-shaped tops, like the poi pounders, those are strictly northern coast, but the northern coast ones don't have the flared bottoms, right? So one of the other artifacts that I'm looking for is I'm going to do a thing on combs from the Ozette site, and they look just like tattoo combs from Polynesia.
This archaeological site called Ozette was buried by a mudslide 250 years ago and has since brought up many interesting artifacts. Grant continued to show us numerous artifacts that hinted at the connection between Polynesia and the northwest coast.
Now you could see that those eyes, this is the only one that has eyes with that particular motif. There's a few Polynesian things that are sort of close to that, If it's a piece of crap, it goes to archaeology, and if it's not, that's from the ethnologist's point of view, right? In addition to the bone ones, you have some that are stone, and
yes,
beautifully made. A lot of work put into that kind of thing. The question of connections between Polynesian here is not on their agenda, So when you say, why aren't people studying Polynesia, they don't know anything about it. And you get people in British Columbia that know nothing about the archaeology of Washington and vice versa. Yet, how can you be a good archaeologist and not know what's in the neighboring areas? So I'm looking at clubs. I'm looking at tattoo things, bark beaters, bark shredders. But obviously, doing DNA on skeletal material, something like that, would be would pretty well clinch it.
Tor Heyerdahl's research led us to Grant Keddy, who has confirmed the likelihood of long-distance canoe travel and has shown us a multitude of artifacts that are so similar that one has to ask, are these people indeed cousins across the sea? So leaving Grant in the beautiful city of Victoria, we decide to get back on the little plane for the very long journey with a very short pit stop back to Haida Gwaii, to see what else can we uncover that illustrates the connections between Polynesia and the northwest coast.
I'm standing outside the Haida Heritage Centre, a building that has been built for the Haida people to learn more about their culture through their dancing and through their songs.
After a very sodden celebration of the Haida Heritage Centre's anniversary, we were able to catch up with Sean Young, the archaeologist on contract to the museum here. And it has to be said that Sean looks very Polynesian.
We always make jokes with them that either vice versa. We're like, well, maybe you came from here and just left here because the weather sucked and you wanted to go somewhere where it's nicer. Because it would make no sense leaving Hawaii and coming here where the weather sucks.
I understand that the Haida do earth ovens.
Quite similar to the Maori. Build a fire, big cobbles, get it really hot, like pretty much let it burn for half a day and then let it burn down. Remove the cobbles, dig the pit up, because you take the heat from where it was dug. Put your big cobbles in the bottom and start layering it with your leaves and stuff, and we use burlap sacks and stuff, like wet them. Same as the leaves, wet them and put all your food there and cover them again with the leaves and then burlap sacks, and then fill up the earth on top from the fire and then leave it for half a day.
From the Haida, just south of Alaska, to the Maori of New Zealand, their earth ovens are almost identical. What else did we find? We have talked to a gentleman called Robert Cross who has a son who was born with a birthmark on the lower part of his back, and they spent some time in Hawaii, and there in Hawaii this child was accepted, acknowledged as being of Hawaiian blood, because apparently there is this birthmark on a lot of Hawaiian people, this lower back birthmark. It's not a tattoo, it is like a genetic marker. We were pleased to hear from Cliff Thompson in New Zealand that this birthmark is a characteristic of most Polynesians.
All of us, all of us, every single Māori has one born on there. It's like a bruise on the backside here, and it just disappears in time.
Okay. During our research, we noticed that there were many connections between Canada and Polynesia, including place names and voyaging stories. So how adventurous were the Haida on the ocean?
Haida's pretty much in a nutshell were the Vikings of the Northwest Coast. Well, we traded a lot.
Yeah.
We intermarried with certain nations, but we also raided and brought war to a lot of nations, from the Thlinket in southern Alaska all the way down past Washington State. Our canoes were found in Northern California.
Sean's description of extensive canoe travel reminds me of the stories that Grant Keddy told us back in Victoria.
So there's actually these oral traditions talking about named individuals. He took his family and they left, and often never to be heard from again. And so where did many of these people end up? Out to sea somewhere. We never hear those stories. And so there's only this one Haida story. A man and a woman went out were out fishing in a canoe. They got blown out to sea, and they were continued to be blown out to sea for 3 weeks. They came to a place where there were people wearing red, and one can interpret that as, red cloaks of a Hawaiian island or something like that. But all we know is that they're wearing some kind of, they were described as being sort of red on the upper part, and these people treated them nicely. They stayed with them, they fed them. They stayed there for 5 years. Then they told them it was time to go, and they said, because you live to the east to the rising sun, which then by that alone implies that you're on an island somewhere way offshore. They taught them how to follow the birds, and they mentioned specific birds that did this migration. So these people left, and the bird landed on their canoe, and when the bird left, they changed the direction of their boat to where the bird went, and they kept doing this. The birds would land on their canoe, and they kept changing direction. So they got back home by following the birds that were heading to the shore.
Grant and Sean have confirmed for us that ocean travel between the northwest coast and Hawaii is totally plausible on several counts. The most important point he makes here is that these early seafarers had total faith in following the birds. Ornithological studies have shown that these birds fly from Canada to New Zealand every year, and the Pacific voyagers would have used them along with their detailed knowledge of ocean swells and star navigation to reach the far-flung corners of the Polynesian Triangle. These ancient voyaging routes were preserved in their chants, as evidenced here by this beautiful Haida story told by author Barry Brailsford.
I'm going to tell you about the visit by the elder from the Haida and his son. As soon as I met them, I knew it was a time of ceremony, in as much as he brought great mana, and so did his son, that this was a very special visit that they're making to this land. And the Haida put on all their gear, their beautiful costumes, and then they told their stories. And they told the story of sailing to Japan and back and other voyages, but also the story of coming to New Zealand a long time ago and then sailing home again. When they tried to explain, in response to the questions, how they navigated, in fact how they got to Hawaii, which they were starting to release to the world. We've been places. We had great abilities on the ocean. To get to Hawaii, they followed the hummingbird. The hummingbird doesn't go beyond the shore. How did you follow the hummingbird? Of course, what they didn't understand was that the hummingbird was a star pattern. I think if you could go to a newspaper in Hokianga back in 1938, you might discover there a report about an old man, a grandfather from the Haida, who took his son called Grey Wolf, who was then just 12, and said, we're going to make a seagoing kayak. And they took 2 years to do it, according to Grey Wolf. And the grandfather told the lad, we're going to make a great journey to a land far away across the ocean. And they arrived in the Hokianga in New Zealand in 1938. And they stayed for a time, then they went back again. And Grey Wolf came here in the early 1990s and shared his story. Puts this whole understanding of how these people were capable of making such amazing journeys and returning from whence they came. It puts back there the amazing, amazing abilities of people of long ago. Abilities that we've set aside, don't even bring to mind.
What was fascinating about Barry's account of the Haida's visit is that they followed an ancestral sailing route that took them straight to Hokianga Harbour, the landing place of Kupe.
Kupe, and he was probably the one who's said to discover New Zealand. Okay, he landed up in Hokianga Harbour, which is up there, and he fashioned an adze, greenstone adze, down the South Island, and it took it back. Thomas couple must have came quite a few generations after that, but he ended up with the adze, which he got someone to fashion the Te Arawa canoe with.
The connection between Kupe and greenstone is intriguing, as it was a prized material in both New Zealand and the west coast of Canada. Is this a clue as to where Kupe originally came from?
So they would make finished jade artifacts up in the interior of the province and trade those down to the coast. And they're actually cutting these with pieces of schist that have garnet in it. So garnet's actually, that phrase is very hard, but garnet's harder. Like they sawed this through from both sides and snapped it off and then ground it down. A lot of work went into these things.
Greenstone to us is the most valuable stone in the world. More valuable to us than gold. What other culture in the world holds it up in that sort of significance? Definitely the Chinese, or the pre-Chinese, you know? Yeah, and the Haida, so you've got the Canadians, natives as well. And it's probably for the same reason too. It's a connection to spirit, spirituality.
Continuing on our quest, we head to a place where Tor Heyerdahl noticed some interesting ancient petroglyphs. We're going to get ourselves on a boat and we're going to go for a whole day to a place called Boogaloo. And Boogaloo will hold surprises and treasures that we have yet to imagine. It's pretty chilly, but it's not too bad. It is kind of nose freezing kind of weather, but never mind.
As we come into the little harbour of Bellacoola, we're reminded of the high cliffs of the Waipio Valley. This is, in fact, the place that Tor Heyerdahl believed the Polynesians first came from.
A man named Tor Heyerdahl, he built a raft and he crossed the Pacific to prove that travel was done. And his son stood here with me about 8-9 years ago, Tor Heyerdahl's sons. They were retracing their father's footsteps, his lifespan. Having them walking around here, I thought, wow, this is history, you know, this is history. I believe it was like the Maori people were known to be travelers of the Pacific Ocean. They traveled to Pacific Rim looking for a place to call their own. And I believe they came in looking in here.
We got this phone call from a friend in Auckland. He said, oh, I've come across these Haida people who are going around trying to find people who know about the ancient voyaging, and they found no one, and they go in 2 days, and can you help them? But one of the stories they shared was quite amazing for me, and that, well, we were both stunned by it. With the San Andreas fault line running right up through to Alaska and through the islands, you know, there was a lot of earthquake activity, a lot going on, and now at extreme low tides they were actually finding there were squares of rock or rectangles of rock the size of refrigerators and more that were squared on all sides, and they couldn't understand what these were. They were starting to intrigue them, so they made a big effort and they cleaned off all the marine life, and they found there were carvings in the stone. And we know nothing of these. We don't know what these symbols are. So they shared a lot of things, and then the elders shared some of their voyaging stories. It was a lovely occasion, you know, that was very supportive. And then the old lady, she looked at the tohunga, just gave a little nod and said, and he knew to go to the corner where there were 5 talking sticks. I've seen them, there's always 4 or 5 there. And he took each stick in turn and he looked at it, then he chose one and he brought it back and he gifted it to the old one. Well, they left late in the day, early the next morning, and they had to fly to Vancouver. And when they arrived, their shaman from the village was actually waiting for them. He couldn't bear to wait at home. He just had to make sure the old one was safe. He was there at the airport, and when they came out, the old one was carrying the talking stick, the tuku. And he placed it in front of the shaman, held it like this, and the shaman took it and looked at it and turned it over and looked at it and turned it over and looked at it, held it close, and he wept over it. Because on the stick were carved the symbols that were on the stones that were coming out of the ocean.
In the creation of the world, when the earth was yet cold and frozen, we didn't have our sun or our stars yet. Our elders say everything was chawi sus, the color of copper or a golden color. That was the color of the world before we had the sun. That's my Nukhalk name, chawi sus, the color of the world before the sun and stars.
This reminds us of a similar legend that we heard while we were in Haida Gwaii.
The Haida, they have a legend of the sky and the earth being the same color, and that at some stage there is a person or creature that has created a separation between the land and the sky. And this is a very, very important part of their creation legends.
The Maori of New Zealand also have a very similar legend of the separation of the sky from Mother Earth.
Ranginui is the Sky Father, and Papa Tuanuku is our Earth Mother. And there is a legend that they were locked in an embrace, and that was prior to being separated by the gods that lived in between them, which were their children.
In Neah Bay in Washington State, just down the road from the OZ site, Micah McCarthy, a Makor tribal leader, also talked to us about their separation of the sky legend.
Western science a number of years ago sort of validated the legend that there was a time when people couldn't see the sun because Earth was enshrouded by such a heavy cloud and fog cover that for generations people never got a chance to see the sun or the moon. It just got light and dark, and nobody could see the stars or the sky. And so there's a story in the Puget Sound about lifting up the sky, because if the clouds were so low.
Micah, the Haida, Nettie and Chris are all telling the same ancient legend. So what are these stories depicting? What could have caused the sun and the stars to be obscured from view for so many generations? One possibility is that a comet struck the Canadian ice shield nearly 13,000 years ago, triggering volcanoes and filling the atmosphere with dust. This comet showered southeastern America with bullets of water that gouged out 500,000 craters known as the Carolina Bays. It also showered North America with microscopic nanodiamonds that can still be found in the sediments today. Sad to say, there would have been few survivors. Subsequently, there was a significant repopulation of America around 12,500 years ago from East Asia by a seafaring people who carried a characteristic female DNA marker known as haplogroup B. The arrival in Canada of this female DNA is recorded in an old Chilcot story which says, "Some strange people came from the Western Ocean. Among them were two sisters. They landed on Doll Island in southeastern Alaska. There, the sisters met and married men whose people were coming down the rivers from the interior. One sister went with her family to Haida Gwaii. Her children grew and multiplied into the Haida Nation. The other sister went with her family to Prince of Wales Island and became the ancestress or mother of the Tlingit Nation." What is most interesting is that the people of the Pacific Northwest and the Polynesians share a unique piece of DNA called HLA-BW48, once thought to be unique to the Polynesians. This genetic relationship between the Polynesians and the people of coastal Canada shows that they were all part of the same group that left East Asia to travel across the North Pacific via the Kuroshio Current about 12,000 years ago. This migration event from the east is also recorded in a Hawaiian oral tradition describing the adventures of Hawaii Loa. Adventures which took place so long ago that Hawaii was geographically quite different. He left from the Yellow Sea on a fishing expedition, travelling east with the constellation of Pleiades, which led him to the islands of Hawaii. After reprovisioning his ship, he sailed back to East Asia, gathered up his family and returned to colonize the idyllic islands of Hawaii. The genealogy of Hawaii Loa shows that he lived many generations before Papatūānuku and Ranginui, before the time of chaos and before the great floods at the end of the last ice age that not only flooded the coastal plains of East Asia, but also the islands of Hawaii. The Hukumukalani Hukumukahonoa says that there were people living in Hawaii before these great floods. Up until about 7,000 years ago, the Hawaiian Islands formed an island chain over 2,500 kilometers long, stretching far into the North Pacific. This would have presented an ideal stopover for seafarers. I have an idea. There might have been people living there a very long time ago. Let's have a deeper look now at what this legend actually says. The first man and woman who came from Alaska to Hawaii were Kalonikekeke and his wife Humue Apule. They were said to be high chiefs of the people of the East and the people of the West. They arrived in Hawaii before it was disrupted by a great flood. This great flood carried away from Hawaii a floating log of wood, which then drifted all the way back to Alaska. If the history of Hawaiian habitation is as deep as these legends suggest, what other evidence can we find to back it up?
According to our own handed down oral histories, it goes very far back.
Goes a long way back.
We're in the middle of the Pacific Sea, all of the Hawaiian chain. Each has their own energy and their own quality. So I dare not speak on the different islands, but I will speak of Molokai. And Molokai is the pico of the universe. When time began, it began here. And after the flood, many went out. But in the now, they are coming back home. It was a whole continent in the Pacific Ocean, as Atlantis was a continent in the Atlantic Ocean.
Hawaii itself dates back to the time when Sumerians was writing Sumerian. We were called the Mu people.
The Mu.
Mu, M-U. Probably your times of your mystical times and all that, Atlantis and all those times. So nobody charted an ocean like we did.
Absolutely.
Like they was sailing around the world from the times they were building Egypt, they said.
What other evidence is there in Hawaii that people were living here in ancient times?
Over here is a fully functioning fish pond. It's actually called the Fish Pond of the Kings. These fish ponds are ancient in design and they are being renovated and restored as much as possible. What they haven't been able to restore, however, are the other fish ponds that you actually can only see through Google Earth or if you actually dive on them. And those are the ones that are even further out here. They're exactly the same design, but they are now anything between 1 and 2 meters below the surface of the ocean. So at some stage, somebody built those fish ponds out there and the water has now risen above them, or the land has sunk down, possibly a combination of them both.
But what is interesting about these islands is that almost in every single case there is subsidence of the islands of about 4.5 inches every 50 years. That works out to be, in our reckoning, about 5 meters every 2,000 years. Which of course begs the question that if there has been people here for a lot longer than the scientists say, do we not think there'd be an awful lot of artifacts underneath the sea? One place that has yet to be fully explored underwater is a rocky islet jutting out of the ocean 480 kilometers northwest of Hawaii. It is called Makumanamana, Island of Great Reverence. This island was originally 70 by 40 kilometers in size, and it still features 36 sacred heiaus. It is situated directly under the path of the star constellation known as Matariki or Pleiades. Matariki is considered to be the navigational homing constellation for Hawaii, the ancestral homeland of most Polynesians, as mentioned here by artist and historian Kerry Strongman.
This is a high tiki,
which is said to be one of our ancestors that came again from Matariki or the Pleiades. Most of the Polynesian cultures acknowledge that we came from that star system.
On the island of Mokumanamana, curious stone statues were found. Could these be an indication of the Menehune, the earliest people in the Hawaiian Islands? Remnants of this culture are most apparent on Kauai, the closest island to Mokumanamana. Perhaps Aletha could cast some light on this question.
First people were the Menehunes. William Hyde Rice was a collector of legends here on Kauai. I believe he was the beginning of enhancing them as little people, as leprechauns, or whatever you want to call them, you know. Anthropologists have never found any small skeletal remains to say that we had a population of
two
little
people.
No, they never had that. They did a census, and a few people that wrote in Menehune, and they were from the Wainiha on the North Shore.
Down near the Waimea River, there is a thing called the Menehune Ditch. It is said that these people were here before times of the Hawaiian, and they were an engineering sort of people who knew how to build fish ponds and ditches. And we just met some people who live here, right here in the Waimea Valley, and those people have just said that their ancestors were of Menehune extraction.
The people in that valley have maintained that ditch right through the years, and there were these people that looked a little bit different to your average Hawaiian. And I said, are you connected to the people that built this ditch? And they said, oh yeah, we are Menehune. And he had this...
He had a top knot.
He had this top knot.
With a stick through it.
The Menehune tie their hair up in a top knot and put a stick through it. Has your family's always lived here?
I live here.
Yeah? Yeah. You still farm here?
Yeah, I live right down the road.
Taro or?
A taro. But I'm not connected to the ditch.
You're not connected?
No. My husband is. Yeah, my husband is.
Okay, so here we have ancient sunken fish ponds, numerous shrines on remnant islands, mysterious statues and tales of the Menehune. How much deeper can it get? Surely this validates yet again the veracity of our legend. Why has this history been forgotten, and what happened to the Menehune?
And when the Tahitians came, they were put to work. They became the slaves. Now, in Tahiti, if you look at that word, slave is manahune.
This Tahitian invasion of approximately 1240 AD is what many archaeologists believe establishes the time of the initial colonization of these islands. This is when the warrior Pa'ao invaded the islands of Hawaii, an invasion that changed everything.
There was a man called Pa'ao who came from the islands of Tahiti, and he saw that there were a peaceful people living here. He came back with a whole band of warriors, several ships, and he landed on these shores ready to corrupt the leaders and the gods of the Hawaiians and change the entire system. He changed the entire system by bringing in a kapu system, which was like a punishment system, whereby the smallest infringement of the law that he laid down would be dealt with by death.
The Tahitians brought the rank,
yes,
and the nobility, the commoners, the slaves. Yeah. It was all after the Tahitians came. Society changed.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we celebrate and we say, oh, this is Hawaiian culture. It's not the true Hawaiian culture. It's been flavored and Tahitians.
Now, the scientists who call themselves the chronological hygienists suggest that the large ceremonial sites here in Hawaii were built after the Tahitian invasion. But is this so? Because of the position of this particular heiau and the fact that it sits on this wonderful natural bay, which would have been deep enough to bring ships in, there would have been structures here prior to this particular heiau being built. Tragically, there was another heiau sitting here in the water. Now this heiau has sadly disappeared altogether. There was a certain amount of interaction with explosive devices, and that could have had something to do with the fact that that heiau is no longer visible, which is a pity. It was visible up till about 1950. There's another heiau over that way called Mu'ukini. It was actually built in 480 AD. That's 1500 years ago. So with the scientific paperwork that says that there have been people here only, let's be generous and say 1200 years, where did the people come from to build that heiau? Ostensibly, according to the records, they needed 18,000 people to build it. And they brought large volcanic rock from 14 miles away to build that heiau Mu'ukini. Where did these people come from if there was no population? It seems to me that there must have been an awful lot more people here than the scientists are willing actually to admit.
So it seems that there is a lot of circumstantial evidence suggesting that people have been living in Hawaii for a lot longer than is commonly believed. If so, Polynesians have actually been here since before the floods that came after the last ice age. Just like the legend says. It is logical, therefore, to assume Hawaii is in fact the crucible of Polynesian society. Hawaii, the homeland.
Legend says our lava tube up here in Wailua connects from here to New Zealand. And there's a rock in New Zealand that's pointed up, and there's a spring water. Anyways, the water is said to be from Hawaii. When they die, the people in New Zealand, they believe that their souls come here.
Our quest in this film was to establish if 800 years of habitation of the Hawaiian Islands, as asserted by some scientific papers, stacks up against the ancient legend of Hukumukalani, Hukumaka. What have we discovered? Oral traditions are revered by the people and ignored by most scientists. Archaeologists agree that canoe travel of that era is highly plausible. We have seen that ancient legends from the northwest coast are very similar to those of Polynesia. But most compelling is the multitude of tools, artifacts and canoe designs that are so similar that one could imagine that the Polynesians and the people of the northwest coast were indeed cousins across the sea. The Hawaiian people have a right to their true ancestry. What will it take to publicly acknowledge this legend and give Solomon Paleolani back his deserved place in history, and share with the Hawaiian people the full legend of Hukumukalani, Hukumu Kahonoa?